that would be, yeah. But wait a minute, though. Well, we gave him 40 because, how much did he ask for? 40. No, he didn't have, but I mean, how much did he ask for? So we gave him 15. Right? Isn't that right? Because there's 2 hours there. So that was 10. We were 8 and 4, 6 hours, 8 and 1/2, and 1 and 4. So we were 21 and a half, and we paid 40. So we gave him 50. I need to write that on. I'll be sure to make notes of that. Right there on the sheet.
This is Jim Alderman, and it's today's the 6th day of February 2007, and we're going to talk about Asa Pillsbury and boating and the Marina here.
From what I remember on Uncle Ace was probably back about, I think it was about 1940, and when he was working here, and I was still in school, but I'd come over here a lot, and then I ended up working summers for a couple of years when I was in high school. And Uncle Ace, the first boat I saw him build here, he built, in fact the boat is right out here when you get through with this here. In fact, we got it hauled out, is the little Gulf One design, my baby. It's a beautiful little boat, and I can remember him building that here, laying it out, and build her upside down. And let's see, she's 20, I think she's 28 foot. And then later he built 2 of the little sailboats, the Hampton One design class. And then of course the war broke out, and then I was gone and kind of lost track of him. Then he wasn't working here too much after the war, I don't think. And of course you know about where he lived out on Palmasola, and he would come. He had a little Model T Ford truck that he used to come to work in. He had made took a little Model T and cut it down and had a little pickup bed on the back of it, and from what I remember, no windshield or top. And he would drive that from Palmasola all the way around over Green Bridge and here to the boat works and work and drive it back home every day. Then later he had a real nice launch that he built. It was probably 30, 32 foot or so, and that was a nice boat that he built. I can remember it. It had he had a Buick engine in it, and it was, I don't know if it had a clutch or not. I think it might have been hooked up direct drive. I'm not sure, but I know he didn't have a steering wheel or anything. He just had a outboard rudder with 2 ropes on it, and he would just stand up there, and that's where he'd steer it. But it was a nice boat. It had no windshield. It had a trunk cabin on it, and he'd just stand up behind that trunk cabin, and he came back and forth to work in that a few times.
Yeah, I remember the Model T. I think even back in 1960, he still had it.
He could have.
And then he had a tractor that was about the same vintage.
Yeah.
You know, an old tractor.
Well, he told me that he used to take he also had I saw it out there one time, but he wasn't using it, but he had a Model T Ford dump truck, a little dump truck, and he told me that he used to drive that up and down the beach. and he would take and pick up and rake up seaweed. You know, when the old gumbo
Right.
would come in,
Right.
he'd rake up all that gumbo, and he said that was the best fertilizer, and he put that around his mango trees.
I remember the same story. He said that he would take it and he would spread it out and let the rain wash the salt out. And then when it got, sort of the salt got washed out, then he would haul it,
And put it around the
under
mango
the
trees.
trees.
He said that was the best fertilizer. And so I really don't know that much about Uncle Ace. I know he was really a fine gentleman. I enjoyed watching him work. He used mostly all hand tools back then in the 40s when I knew him. And I don't even know if he.
Now, was he a boat builder by trade, or was that just one of the things that he did?
I don't know. Well, the story I got was that he started as a very young man, and he worked with Bat Fogarty.
Uh-huh.
And they built a bunch of those skipjacks that they had out at Cortez.
Right.
And he just always used to talk about the skipjacks, but I never saw one, and there wasn't any around that I know of. A lot of them, I think, was converted over to little launches. See, the skipjack was 21 foot, and if you think about it, see, that design came from up in the Carolinas. And when this group of young men from up there came to Cortez and set up a fish camp, which became Cortez, and they brought those boats with them. Well, then later, the story I get was, well, they would build. Of course, those kind of boats is something that everybody just built their own. So there wasn't any exact plan, but the conception was all about the same, and the type of rig was all about the same. And of course, everybody had their own little variations, Well, understand that he and Bat Fogarty built a lot of them, and I just believe that picture that you saw that floats around, there's a copy of it up there. There's an art of conception of it. See, the one up there, the Cortez Skipjacks. The big picture up here, the big white one.
Yep.
And I just almost believe that that's some that Uncle Ace and Bat Fogarty built. And they look a little bit different than the ones from the Carolina. You notice they got a little bit of a curved stem on them. And but I still think that they were the ones that built those. Because he told me they built a lot of them. And he used to sail them. He said, and I guess he fished them some, because he told me a few times that he would, the whole group of them, they always worked in a team. And of course, see, they had no power.
Right.
And so they would sail out to where they would find the mullet. And that rig was real easy to kill the rig. They would take and, because they had no boom, they'd just take the sprit down, roll the sail around the mast, a little short mast, and then they'd use a sprit for a poling oar. And some of the sprits, I think, had a little wider blade on one end, so that was their poling oar. And they, in the shallow water, they'd pole to set the nets. Well, then he'd say there would be, I don't know, I'd guess maybe 4 or 5 of them. They'd sail over to Mullet Key, and he said they'd strike the mullet, and they'd get a nice big load, but he said they always raced back. So anytime you got a sailboat, you end up racing. Even so, back then, he really thought the skipjack was a good boat.
Well, it was Uncle Johnny. He was one of the founders of Tampa Yacht Club, and he had fish houses.
Okay.
And so there was always just a competition to see who could get back first. Sometimes they got more money. The guy who brought the fish in first got more money than the guy who brought fish when they already had as much as they needed. They didn't pay as much. So the guy who got in first literally, made out like a bandit, and the one that got in last might have to throw away his catch if there was no market for it.
Could be.
But Clark and I used to talk to Clark Mills, and we'd talk about, skiffs and that transition when motors started coming in. And what was the difference between a motorboat and a sailboat was just one had a motor, one didn't. That they had to take some of the old sailboats and convert them.
I think that's what they did. I think in one of their favorite engines, I understand, was the Star. And there was a little automobile called the Star. It had a little 4-cylinder engine in it. And I think the Star might have been what they called an assembled car. But I think that engine was a Continental engine. I'm not sure. But it was evidently a good little 4-cylinder engine. And that was at one time was one of their favorites to put in the boats. And so I would imagine that's what happened to a lot of the skipjacks, that they were still good. But see, back then the boats were not built to last. People don't realize that. Labor was cheap and material was cheap, and I think most of them were put together with just galvanized nails, and they were good boats. And if they'd have been fastened with some silicon bronze or Monel, there could probably still be a lot of them around today, because most of them was all built out of cypress.
Well, a lot of times they were purpose built. I mean, they were built for a war, or they were built to carry a bunch of people across, and then when that was done, it was done.
Yeah.
You know, they invaded England, and what did they need the boats for? You know,
Well, but Uncle Ace was quite a guy. I remember I always admired him. He was kind of one of my heroes.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I
just
thought of him
admired
as a
him.
hero.
He was just a real fine gentleman.
And he was like barefoot most of the time.
Oh yeah.
And when I met him, you know, we were visiting over at his house, and he said, "Who are you?" You know, and I said, "Well, I'm Tom Mayers," and he said, "Well, you know, Mayers, I don't know who that is. You know, who's your relatives?" And I said, "Well, I was John Savary's, you know, great nephew." And he said, "Oh, that he had a trophy that belonged to me." It was one that John Savary's had won after a race, after Asa had won it, and he never got the trophy to John Savary's, because, you know, he had the trophy from winning the race.
I'll be darned.
And it was just funny that he had such a keen mind, and he was living in that house by himself.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the dogs all stayed outside.
Well, no, because we took him hopping, John.
Oh,
you
you
know,
did?
that black beans
Oh,
and rice, because
yeah.
we go visit him like on New Year's.
Oh, you had to have Hoppin' John on New Year.
Oh yeah, we had an archaeologist from England who was visiting one of the girls. You know, my sisters were both good looking, and they always had these guys coming, you know, following them around. And this guy from England came over, and so we said, "Well, come with us, and we'll introduce you to Asa, and you can see his Indian mound." And so we went in, and I took this thing of Hoppin' John and put it on his table. And, you know, we went back out and started talking, and then the next thing you know, you heard all this racket inside the house. And, you know, I went in, I was the kid, so they sent me to check, and I went in to see what was going on, and the dogs were, you know, gotten up on the table, knocked it off the table, and then were eating it on the ground. And I came out and I said, Asa, you know, the dogs ate your Hoppin' John. And he didn't change his expression at all. He just said, "Well, I didn't have it before you got here, and I don't have it now." So that was like, no problem.
Yeah.
So can you tell me about the Marina here, and your dad and the bishops and all that? Or
Well, there's not too much to tell there. That Dad just worked for them for many years on their yachts.
he was their captain.
See, we came from Tarpon Springs,
Uh-huh.
and we moved here in 1920. I think it was about 1925
Wow.
or 26, along in there, because I was about 2.5 years old, and I was born in late in 23, and my grandfather had a sawmill there on the Anclote River, right there in the area, right there just off of what's now called Alternate 19, right downtown there.
Right.
And not downtown, but I mean down on the waterfront.
Right.
And that little yacht basin in there now in Tarpon Springs, that little city yacht basin, they use that for a holding pond. And my dad run it. Well, there's a drawing of his tugboat up there. I don't know whether you saw that or not.
Uh-huh.
And he did a lot of logging all up around, all the way from Cedar Keys on down Crystal River. And
So
all
he'd
that.
actually go cut the logs and.
Oh yeah, they did a lot of logging, and then they would make rafts and bring them down the Gulf into there, and then they did a lot of in the area around.
And this was Captain Jim. That was your dad.
That was my father, and well, then the sawmill burned, And so Grandpa lost that, and back then he had no insurance or anything, but so he just didn't rebuild it. And he had an orange grove up there right near what we used to call it Lake Butler. They call it Lake Tarpon now, and outside of Tarpon. And so my dad was out of work, so he had a chance. His brother-in-law, his oldest sister, lived in Sarasota, and they worked. He was the captain on Mr. Selby's yacht, and that's it right here. That's the one that's on the waves up here. This one right up here.
Right.
It's a 75-foot Mathis houseboat, and that belonged to Mr. Selby. Well, then they needed a deckhand. Well, Dad was just a real young guy then, and the captain on there was Captain Rowe. And so my dad went to work on the boat for, I don't think it was for too long a time. And then Mr. Bishop bought the boat, and when he bought it, well then Dad stayed with the boat. And that's how he got to know him. Then they was on a different.
And did they take big trips on the boat, or?
On that one, I don't know how far they went on that one.
Didn't
But then right soon after that, they sold it, and then he bought the big 135-foot Ripple.
Didn't he go down to the Amazon or something?
Yeah, but not in this. That was in the.
This was your dad was captain though.
No, that was after they sold it. He stayed on for a short time.
Right.
And they went down there for the new owner of that.
And was there a story that Miss Bishop wouldn't let him leave on Friday the 13th? They had to wait. Or
I never.
Did you ever hear that?
No.
I heard something like that.
Yeah,
and I don't know what that
I
was.
never heard anything like it.
Uh-huh.
And so then later on, well then Dad went to work here at the boat works.
And this was the Bishop's boat works.
Yeah, it belonged to them. Yeah.
And you know, the Lady Patty, was that the Bishop's boat or a sailboat?
Yeah.
I had a picture of that Clark Mills had down in Havana.
Okay.
He was on a Havana race, and the Lady Patty was in the race.
See, it was built. It was built in 1936. It was built up in Solomon Island, Maryland.
It was a pretty boat.
It's a nice boat.
Is it still around?
It's up there now. It's back up there on Tilghman Island, I think they call it, up there. It's on the eastern shore.
Right.
Well, you know what happened was it was sold and a couple of times, and then the one fellow that got it, he fiberglassed all the outside of the hull,
right,
and laid it up real heavy, and tore all the wood out on the inside, but retained all the deck. Did a nice job.
right.
And the boats up there, they use them in charter service now. They take people out day sailing.
Wow.
And she still looks good, all original. The superstructure. And
I
everything.
just remember her sitting under the shed here.
Yeah.
She was always a pretty boat, unusual with a double
Yeah, it's a
lens.
Rhodes design. Yeah.
Well, I think the main thing around here was shallow draft boats. If you didn't have a shallow draft boat, you kind of had a problem.
We all felt that way, and I'll never forget when we first started. Well, you know, usually the most all of your boats here did have centerboards, and then later when they, well, I guess a lot of your FRA boats, a lot of them were all centerboard boats. Well, then later when they got into the SRC, they started sending down these keel boats, you know, these Yankee boats, and then they started coming in. And I thought, you know, what do people want? You know, you can't, you know. So they had to sail the channels pretty well. Once they got in the Gulf, of course, like going to Lauderdale, you had plenty of water. But they sure wasn't very practical to use around here.
Right.
And you take, like Charlie Morgan, you know, he designed that Paper Tiger, which was a nice boat. And she was centerboard. And, of course, your Lady Patty was centerboard. And I still think a centerboard boat is the way to go in Florida because you got so much shallow water, you know, it's still the way to go.
Well, I don't think many people really even know that that some of the America's Cup boats were centerboarders.
Now that I didn't know.
Yeah, some of them were centerboarders. That you look at some of the old ones, I think there was one called Mischief or something like that, and just a real centerboarder. Looks racy as it can be, you know, like a dinghy almost.
Yeah.
So, and that was one thing I used to talk to Clark about was skiffs. You know, the origin of the skiff. And I said, you know, where did the skiff design come from? And he said, well, he didn't know for sure, but he heard that it came from the Connecticut River. That there were farmers that were trying to get things to the market.
Okay.
And they'd make the simplest thing they could, which was a barge. And then the next thing to do with a barge is to put a pointy end on one end. And that was the big flat bottom with a pointy end.
Yeah.
Easy to build, that a farmer could build. You didn't have to be a boat builder to build it because it wasn't all that complicated. And he said that was as far as he knew, the beginning of that. And then I guess the skipjack was a development of that type of boat.
Yeah. The one that we call the Cortez Skipjack, that they pretty well named that themselves. Now you think of the Chesapeake Bay skipjacks, they're bigger.
Right.
But then I was reading somewhere where skipjack is a very broad term. It's not a certain size boat, but it's a boat with dead rise, with what we call a V bottom.
Mm-hmm.
They're shallow V bottoms.
Right.
And they're supposed to be an improvement over the old Sharpies. You know, the old flat bottom
Right.
Sharpies were good boats, but then somebody, I guess, designed and they started tweaking them up and they made the V bottom, you know, and it makes I think a little more better boat.
Well, Clark gave me a few models when he was, you know, getting older, and he was just sort of getting rid of some stuff, and he gave me this model, and he said that was the original windmill.
Oh, that.
And
you still got it?
Yeah.
Oh, you want to hang on to that?
And it has a flat in the front instead of a V.
Okay.
And he said that he took it out, and he said it made so much noise, and everybody made so much fun of him, that he got back in his shop right away and put a V in the bow. But he said that his first boat that he built was a flat bottom all the way up to the bow. And then he changed it because it pounded so much. It just, when you were going through the waves, every time you'd hit a wave, it'd make a big noise. So he said he changed it, and he just gave me the model.
Well, now some of your flat bottom boats now, when they're sailing, if they heel pretty good, you actually that chine you got you're sailing on a V.
Right.
You know, but they're now they tell me on the skipjack, like the one I've got out there, and I've got the plans for it. When I say the plans, what happened up there at that museum up there in North Carolina, and they call it Beaufort. Now there's another town spelt like that down in South Carolina, and I think it's a kind of a French accent. They call it Beaufort.
Right.
South Carolina. But up in North Carolina, it's Beaufort.
Right.
And that's where the people in that area right there is where they came to Cortez.
Right.
And those people up there, they built that boat. And what happened, it's got what they call a log bow in it. And the one that I had George Lazier build for me, it's got a log bow. And it's a very shallow V bottom, but they wanted quite a bit of shape right in that forefoot there.
Right.
And so they put a solid piece in there and carved that. And then planked up to it.
Right.
And they said the idea was they wanted to make a very quiet boat so they could slip up on the fish, and with that little, you didn't get a slapping sound out of it.
And Clark, you know, I'm just quoting Clark because remember him talking about his first boats that he built, and he said some of them, to get a proper V in the front, he said it was awful hard. To get it, he says he had to work and use big, thick pieces. He said some of the pieces were 2-3 inches thick that he used as the plank, and then he carved them out. He said he took an axe and kind of shaped them.
Yeah.
But sometimes
so
it's
I
hard
don't know
to do.
whether he ever built any skipjacks or not. He could have built a form of us, you know.
He had a whole bunch of variety of boats that he built, but you know what I thought with Clark, which not many people know, was that the pram that he became most famous for, he said that he designed that to be a Sharpie. That was supposed to be a Sharpie.
Was he going to put a?
He couldn't figure how to do it for $50. They wanted to do it for under $50. And he said that it required an extra piece of plywood to make a Sharpie out of that boat. And so he said that he just one night he got the idea, well, let's just cut the bow off. And he says that way he could use just 2 pieces of plywood.
Yeah, he was trying to make it very
for
simple.
under $50.
That's yeah.
That was the limit. Sails, rigging, everything had to be under $50.
Yeah. And the little things sail pretty good too.
Uh-huh.
Did you ever sail one when you was a kid?
Yeah, well, we used to have a fleet at the north end of Longboat Key, and I don't really remember much about it, but I used to belong to the pram fleet, and I go race. And,
yeah.
But
I always said if you could sail a pram, you'd be a pretty good sailor because they're not an easy boat to sail. And I think these kids do a great job in them because it's so short and stubby. You got to sail it. It's not going to sail itself.
And Clark said that he used to go around with the kids, and he said that one time his pram wasn't the only one. He said there were a bunch of different boats that everybody was trying to have trainer.
Okay.
And he says that they would race other fleets with their boats. And he said, my kids, when the wind would pick up, they'd always take off and leave everybody. You know, so he said that his kids, you know, so he was real proud of them. They'd go out, and he had some real hot sailors, and he'd go around with them, and they'd beat the other boats. And then after a while, nobody wanted any of the other boats because they wanted one of these fast boats that when the wind, and some of those kids, they get going 10, 15 miles an hour easy.
You're kidding.
You see them when they're off the wind, they get planing. It's just like it doesn't matter if you don't have a bow, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you're sailing on the back half of the boat.
Yeah, that's neat.
Well, let's just stop for a second and take a break. Well, you know, that whole race, that was something that
Is that pick up when it started like?
oh yeah, that's what John Marston and that guy, I forget his name, but they were betting at SORC.
Oh, is that what it was? But he was a good sailor, that guy, but he had won a lot of races.
So Asa built that boat.
He built that.
And he built it right here, or where did he build it?
Right there where I've got my skipjack right there covered up, right there. That's the spot it was built on, right there. I remember seeing that. Built it upside down.
Well, who owns this now?
It belongs to Mary Parker.
Well, it certainly takes a lot of work to keep these boats in good shape, doesn't it?
Let's see, how old would that be now? What would that be? 1940 to now? What is that?
Well, that would be 67 years.
Yeah, 67 years old. Pretty good shape for that, don't you think?
And I bet it's a pretty fast boat.
It sails pretty good, yeah. It's a nice boat.
What's this, an owl you have in here?
No, I think it's a pigeon.
Oh, pigeons.
I don't know whether you can see that. Yeah, you can see part of it here, but it's...
Well, that's it. Boy, that's a big one, isn't it?
Yeah.
So was it like a single screw, or do you know?
Yeah, just single screw. When you get over here, you can see a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's great. So that's the Mistletoe's propeller.
That's the missile.
And then your dad salvaged
He
it?
found it, yeah. He salvaged it. Yeah, out there it was where the beach had eroded away, and he was looking out there one day in the sand right there back of the. He broke up beside the waves, not behind the wave, right beside of it. And he saw these 4 points sticking up out of the sand. So he got there and dug it out. And That's what it was.
And so when did he dig it out? Was that like
There was an ad in the paper. I mean, there was a piece in the paper about it. I've got an article.
so was that like the
Oh, it's been
30s or
Oh
something
no,
like that?
no, it was
40s?
it was here probably. I'm going to guess probably around 70,
Uh-huh.
65, probably along about the 60 or 65.
And so it was a single screw, is that
Yeah,
what it was?
Yeah, and that's a cast iron propeller. It's iron propeller.
And do you know if the mistletoe, what it was built of? Was it just wooden or?
Yeah, just they wood.
Well, I love these old band saws. That's really, you have a nice collection here.
Yeah.
And those boats up there, is a story behind those? Or those just ones that you've saved? And
Well, that biggest one down there, that was my dad's boat. That was built in 1946. That's a Higgins. It's a after the, they made a lot of PT
right,
boats.
yeah.
And after
It
the
looks
war-
like a little PT
It does.
boat.
It looks like, and they built a lot of PT boats, and then they had material left over because when the war was over, I mean, all contracts were canceled.
Right.
So then they started building some of those little boats there out of plywood. Then that first one way down there, my uncle built that over in Braden when I was just a little kid. I like to tell the story that I helped build that one because I was about 5 years old, 5 or 6, and he'd give me a piece of sandpaper and say, "You go trying to keep me out from under his feet."
I do that with my daughter. I try to get some work out of her, but it's pretty tough. The older she gets, she's getting smarter than I am, so it's hard to get her to do stuff. Well, I've had several people that I've talked to, over the years, just boating and everything, and say that this is one of the best boat yards in the country. Not just in Florida, but just in the country. It's just such a nice atmosphere and nice place to be.